Good afternoon. Welcome to the ARPA State and Local Fiscal Recovery Update. My name is Stacy Massey. I'm the lead of the Ohio Grants Partnership here at the Ohio Office of Budget and Management. And pleased that you all have been able to join us today as we try to decode 437 pages of final rule and kind of help you navigate that process. I want to go over a couple housekeeping items as we get started. Today's session will be recorded, so that recording will be on our website at the end or several days after, so stay tuned for that. If you registered for today's event, we will be emailing you the slides, as well as those will be on our website as well as the recording. So we have approximately 1,200 people registered for today's event, so we will try to have time for questions. However, we have a lot of slides to cover and a lot of information. So as always, if we don't get to your question, you can email us at grants@obm.ohio.gov at any time, and we will help you. If it necessitates a call, we'll give you a call. We are here to kind of help you navigate this process. If you have any technical issues today, you might want to try leaving the event and returning back. Sometimes that clears the issues, but know that it will be recorded, so don't fret. There will be a recording if you do have any issues along the way. And again, I want to thank you for attending. And if you haven't signed up for our Ohio Connects newsletter, you can go out to our website at grants.ohio.gov and it will prompt you to sign up. I encourage you to do that. We do send a lot of tips and tricks and information about grants on that newsletter. So it is a good one to actually get. So please sign up for that. Again, if you have to ask questions throughout, you can tap the questions pane and type your questions in as you think of them. We'll try to get to them. We have some folks from the Ohio Grants Partnership team that will maybe answer them individually. So don't be shy about the questions, but if we don't get to them, we're always here. If you're looking for any previous webinars, you can always visit our site at grants.ohio.gov, and there's a couple areas under helpful resources and grants training. We have a lot of information, as well as funding opportunities. An American Rescue Plan Act, Local Fiscal Recovery has all of the webinars that we've done that's been specific to ARPA funding and the Ohio Grants Partnership. And you navigate over to Ohio Grants Summit. We just did the Ohio Grants Summit on December 7th. A lot of good ARPA material, and those recordings are out there on our website as well. So I'm going to turn it over to OBM Director Kim Murnix.
Thanks, Stacy. Great to be with you all this afternoon on what's at least here in Central Ohio, a snowy and cold afternoon, but thank you again for joining us. I don't want to take up too much of your time because, like Stacy said, we have a packed agenda today, but we're happy to be able to unpack some of that final Treasury ARPA rule for you. Stacy and team have been spending the last couple of weeks going through those 400 plus pages of information and are excited today to talk through some of the additional flexibilities, some of the additional clarity around reporting and purchasing and all of those rules. And we hope that the information that you receive today will enable you to use those dollars to the greatest effect in your community. We think that it looks like Treasury listened on some of the flexibility requests that we and others have had, so we're excited about that. And again, on behalf of Governor DeWine and the entire team here at the state level, we want to thank you again for everything that you do each and every day for communities throughout Ohio. Our work and our partnership has, I think, put Ohio in a great position, and we just want to keep that momentum going and moving forward together as we enter into this new phase. So with that, I know you'll get a lot of great information today. Always feel like you can reach out to any member of our grants team whenever you have questions. We are here to be that resource for you. And with that, I'll kick it back to you, Stacy.
Thank you, Director. So we're going to get started. Like I said, I have a lot of content today. I have a lot of slides, so I definitely am not going to go through all of the content on the slides. Like I said, they'll be available to anyone that registered as well as on our website. after the presentation so that it can be used as a resource. So I have a lot of content here as a resource, but not necessarily we'll be going through all of it today. So like I said, the final rule did come out on January 6th, and it had about 437 pages of information, but there was another document that did come out, and I will encourage you. So by no means this is not a replacement to reading the rule. However, there is a document. It's called the overview, and we'll talk a little bit about that. It's 44 pages long. So compared to the larger final rule, it's easier to kind of digest to do that overview. So if you want to use our slides as a resource, that's great. But I would also take a look at that overview as you're moving forward. So let's get started. I want to do a quick refresher on the allowable uses. Now, these are all the same. If you see my presentation before, all 4 buckets of allowable uses stayed the same, even with the final rule. There are a lot of changes and nuances, but I wanted everyone to be kind of clear and level set that all 4 buckets are the same. So costs incurred through December 31st of 2024 for public health emergency and negative economic impacts, for premium pay to essential employees, for revenue reduction, and water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. All 4 of those still remain the same. There are a lot of changes and nuances that were introduced with the final rule, which we'll talk about today. But I just want to kind of level set that that hasn't changed. That's in the federal statute for in the ARPA. And so that is still part of this. It's the kind of the basis. So I'm going to talk about the key dates again, just a refresher. Your funds must be costs incurred or obligated is how Treasury is looking at it through December 31st of 2024. Everything is forward looking. The period of performance starts on March 3rd of 2021. So as we talk through things today, especially in the terms of revenue loss, you cannot capture anything prior to March 3rd of 2021. Now the restrictions though do allow you to, although it's to the recipient. So you have that performance period of March 3rd, 2021 through December 31st of 2026 is your period of performance. Must be obligated by December 31st of 2024. But if you do choose to do a program where you aid individuals who are impacted, or you do premium pay, or any of those areas, those, if you're helping a beneficiary, those programs can be for impacts from the beginning of the pandemic. And the Treasury has deemed the beginning of the pandemic as January 27th of 2020. So any assistance programs that you do, as long as you didn't have any commitments or obligations to do those assistance programs prior to March 3rd of 2021, those can be more backward looking. So I wanted to call that out. I know I've talked about that before, but it's also one of those key things to discuss. So let's talk about the other key provisions that continue to remain. So one, you cannot deposit in a pension fund, and that does not include covered benefits. So if you do fund personnel with this funding, you can still pay their payroll portion of their retirement. That is not what is meant by depositing into a pension fund. Contribute to rainy day financial reserves, budget stabilization, or anything like that. So when we talk about revenue reduction, those amounts must be applied to general government services. And if you do happen to have some type of cost savings within maybe your general revenue fund because of the use of revenue reduction, just make sure you leave the funds there. You don't transfer them over to a budget stabilization fund. So that's one of those things that's prohibited. So you don't want to be moving any extra at the end of the year because you've used the revenue loss provision and move that to budget stabilization, and then the funds are not eligible. So offset a reduction in net tax revenue. There's some discussion about that. That applies in statute to the state, but if you do use that at the local level in the revenue reduction space, there's some changes to the calculation that happened in the final rule. I'll talk about that today. Paying any type of debt, tax anticipation notes were allowed in the CRF. They're not allowed with this funding. Satisfying a settlement agreement, judgment, consent decree, any type of debt restructuring plan, not allowable. Serve as non-federal match for other federal grant programs. There's one exception with the revenue loss, which we'll talk about, but the other than that, you cannot do that. As well as using any, so this is a brand new a provision that was added. So you may not use the funds that conflict or counteract the purpose of ARPA statute, which means your use of funds cannot undermine COVID mitigation practices that are in line with CDC guidance and recommendations. So that was just recently added in the final rule as one of the things that you may not do. So let's talk about the final rule and the major provisions. So first, it was adopted on January 6th of 2022. That's going to be an important date because if you are exercising the use of the final rule, then it must be after January 6th of 2022. It is effective April 1st of 2022. It will also be codified in 31 CFR Part 35. And the final rule provides broader flexibility and greater simplicity. It's also important to know, and we'll talk about a lot of this flexibility and simplicity today, but it's important to know that if you use the final rule as of January 6th, the Treasury has released, and that's where I've got additional accompanying documents. They've released a statement regarding compliance with the interim final rule and the final rule, and stating that, if you exercise the requirements in the final rule after January 6th, the Treasury's kind of going to look the other way. So although the interim final rule is in effect as of today, the final rule requirements, you can kind of adopt those now, and the Treasury is okay with that. So they do have, I think it's a 4-page statement that talks through that. If you are starting a new project and it does not align with the final rule, then if you don't have any basis of that project prior to January 6th, then you must start new projects now in alignment with that final rule. And so it's really, that's what's in those 4 pages. And then the other document I talked about is this 44-page coronavirus overview of the final rule. And I really highly encourage you to at least print this off and keep this to kind of help you navigate the 437 pages. Because not only is it 437 pages of a final rule, a lot of it reads in tandem with what was in the interim final rule. So you kind of have to piece those two together. So this really puts it in 44 pages and easier to interpret and put it all together in one context. So let's talk about the terminology that was introduced within the final rule. Should and must, the Treasury comes right off the bat and says that means it's mandatory. So if they use those statements throughout, that means that it's a mandatory requirement. May and encourage is just a suggestion. So you'll see those terms used throughout the final rule. There are other terms such as proportional and reasonable. Those are key concepts that were stressed throughout the rule to determining your level of investment for eligible activities. So essentially, Treasury is saying any project that you do, it must be proportional to the impact and it must be reasonable. It must be relatable to COVID. So those are the terms that have been really kind of key concepts that have been stressed in the final rule. And you'll see some of that in some of my slides today as well. Enumerated by Treasury, that is throughout the final rule. And what that means is when you see that, Treasury has enumerated a list of eligible use of funds. So that enumerated list is throughout all of the additional areas or buckets of funding. And a lot in the public health space has changed with this, with regards to this, and we'll talk about all those enumerated uses today. Impacted and disproportionately impacted have been defined as well. So impact is those that are directly impacted by the harmful effects of the pandemic. Disproportionately impacted, which was kind of a term that was used before for anybody that was in a QCT. That is anyone who's experienced a disproportionate impact based on disparities that were amplified by the pandemic that were maybe pre-existing based on an underserved community. So that is also really addressed throughout, and you'll see how those two areas kind of play out in some presumptions that are in the final rule. So let's talk about the summary of the key changes, and then we'll get into like the meat of all of this. Public health and economic impacts. So that was that first bucket, still the same bucket, but it has been stated now in the final rule that those use of funds and to meet some of the areas within that can be for capital expenditures. That was kind of silent before in the interim final rule. I think it said, that you had that 2 criteria test that if you had an impact and you can design a program to meet that impact, And sometimes they talked about social distancing, which might be kind of construction type, capital type expenditures, but it was really silent on whether or not that was allowable. So Treasury's kind of came out and said that's allowable. They put some parameters on reporting for that. So, and we'll talk through those today. They've also expanded the set of households and communities that are presumed impacted. And that's where I talked about that QCT was the disproportionately impacted presumption before, and that has been broadened. And so we'll talk about how that's been broadened a lot today, as well as there's a broader use of funds to restore and support public sector employment. So there's some really exciting things that they've added that really have loosened up the use of this for public sector. Premium pay, there's an expanded list of eligible workers who can receive it without written justification. If you remember before, it was pretty tight, plus there was a very short list. They have expanded the number of occupations that are on the essential worker list. Revenue loss, we'll talk a lot about that today. It's actually the first concept we're going to hit because I think many of you are probably most interested in this, and this is the most exciting addition to the final rule. They added a standard allowance option, as well as some other minor changes with if you choose to do the calculation on how that calculation pans out. And then last but not least, water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. There's been a lot of broadening and eligibility on broadband projects, as well as there were additional eligible water and sewer projects beyond the 2 grants, EPA grants that were listed that have been added to being eligible use of the funds. So let's talk about revenue loss. And I don't know, I'm very cautious to start with this, but I think we may lose like half the audience after we get through these slides. So, but I wanted to open with the most important change that happened in the final rule. So in the final rule, there was an option added. So before you calculated your revenue loss using that Treasury formula, well, there was an option added in the final rule that you could either do that calculation, or you can elect a standard allowance of up to $10 million in revenue loss through the life of the program. So Treasury recognized that many smaller, especially NEUs, their allocation is much under the 10 million. So they recognize that that might cover an entire allocation. So if you elect that standard allowance of revenue loss, your entire allocation could be used for revenue loss. So that's very encouraging for many townships and many smaller local governments out there that wasn't sure how you were going to use your funding and didn't really feel like you had a revenue loss, because there's no need to illustrate that there was any actual revenue loss. You are afforded the opportunity to say that you are going to use this standard allowance and claim it as revenue loss for your allocation. If your allocation is under 10 million, then that means you can use your entire allocation under the revenue loss bucket. What does that mean? It means you can use all of those funds for general government services up to the revenue loss amount. So if your entire allocation happens to be revenue loss, then you can use it for any general government service. So anything that you would normally or typically fulfill with your general revenue fund. So anything as a government you would provide. So before, you couldn't do road paving unless it was under revenue loss. So if your entire allocation is revenue loss, you could do paving, you could do repairs, you can do anything that you would normally do with like general revenue funds. So that is pretty critical to many of you that are under that $10 million mark, and you can claim your entire thing under revenue loss. Treasury's also indicated that they will try to streamline reporting with regard to this. We do believe that to be the case. We think that Treasury will at least want you to say what type of general government services you've used and report on the expenditures towards those. It's unclear at this time if you'll have to provide more detail than that. That it wasn't very clear in the guidance. They mentioned something about providing that detail through January, but not beyond that. But they have said multiple times throughout both of the final rule and in their 44 pages that revenue loss will be more streamlined for reporting. So your reporting burden is not nearly as rough for reporting revenue loss. So that is a plus for all of us. I'm going to go to the next slide, talk about that. So this is just an example of what Treasury lists, general government services, construction of schools and hospitals, road building, maintenance, health services, general government administration staff, and administrative facilities. So you could fund all of your payroll for a portion of time. Environmental remediation, provision of police fire to include the purchase of fire trucks and police vehicles. So you don't have to look for eligible things within those other buckets. If you would have purchased them normally, that you can use this funding for that purpose. So you do still have the option, and this might be more beneficial to many local governments, to do the revenue loss calculation. And there are some that may be getting a larger allocation beyond the 10 million that find that revenue loss calculation is more important. They're going to get a lot more out of it to use up more of their allocation under a revenue loss category. Some of the changes in the final rule included, so you included one, you could do that calculation now on fiscal year or calendar year. You had to elect one and be consistent. So before it said it was calendar year only, so you had to 4 points in time at December 31st of 2020, 21, 22, and 23. But now you can go back and say, oh, but my fiscal year is in a different point in time, and I would like to do that. Many local governments are in a December 31st, pretty much all local governments on a December 31st year end. So you're probably going to stick with calendar year, but they did afford you that option. They also clarified the base year to be the last full fiscal year prior to this, or January 27th of 2020. I don't know that that was a huge issue for anyone in the state of Ohio, but that was clarified. And they said that you must be consistent. So again, if you do, you have to pick one. You do the standard allocation, or you do the calculation. Once you pick that, you move forward with that the entire time. You can't go back and revert. So it's really important that if you are calculating it, that you kind of do an analysis on what you think you're going to get in the 4 years of doing that calculation and determine whether or not it makes sense to take the standard allowance or to just continue on with that calculation. Do note that the growth adjustment was 4.1% and it has been changed to 5.2%. So there is a new default standard allowance for the formula for the economic growth adjustment. So that if you did your calculation already for 2020 and 2021, you're going to want to go back and adjust that at 5.2%. They did include, and remember before we've talked on some of these webinars about utilities, it was kind of strange. Water was included and sewer wasn't, or vice versa. And so they then made kind of two issues with their general revenue. So the general revenue most generally follows the U.S. Census Bureau definition, but they have now included all utilities and liquor store revenue. Those were two areas I think that were pointed out in a lot of the comments that was contradictory to kind of how their formula worked. So now you would include those in your general revenue. And you also must adjust actual revenue totals for the effect of tax cuts and tax increases that were adopted after January 6th, so their final rule. So I think they realized that it was in the state statute that tax cuts and provisions couldn't impact revenue loss, but it wasn't in the local government portion. And so now they're trying to say that if you are going to do the calculation, you need to take and adjust for any of those actions that you take after January 6th of 2022, so that those would not necessarily be representative of the pandemic. So they're making sure that you're being consistent with that. Revenue loss reminders. So again, if you do choose to use the revenue loss, there are some parameters. So all of the things we talked about before that are prohibited, such as pension contributions, settlements, judgments, debt service, conflicting with anything that's undermining COVID mitigation practices in line with the CDC. All of those things, there's still parameters against your revenue loss use of funds. So you still can't do things that are prohibited. So you can't have revenue loss funds and then go out and pay your debt service. So that's still not allowed. But it does say the revenue loss funds are considered federal funds. So it does point that out, and they still need to follow uniform guidance requirements. So you still must treat them and track them as federal expenditures. They still must show up as you're expending those general government services against the funding on your federal schedule if you have one. It might still qualify you for a single audit, which we are getting some intel that the single audit requirements for those that strictly using for revenue loss and maybe haven't had a single audit before but now qualified for one, those requirements may be a little bit lighter than a traditional single audit. There's more to unfold about that, but provisions of the uniform guidance apply, and procurement is one of them. So if you're going to use anything under the general government services category for revenue loss, you're going to want to make sure that you're following the federal procurement requirements or the most restrictive. So your local requirements may be more restrictive than the federal. So you just need to follow the most restrictive. Your terms and conditions of the award still apply. So conflicts of interest, civil rights, all those things when you sign for the funding, they still apply to the use of funds against a revenue loss. And then they also need to be expended within the period of performance. So it's not that you get these funds and you have a long period of time to use them. You just still have the period of performance obligated by December 31st, 2024, expended by December 31st of 2026. So that doesn't change. But one of the interesting areas I'd say that I had read was that revenue loss can be used as non-federal match for everything, but like it does call out the state's Medicaid and CHIP programs. It's unallowable. So in that revenue loss category, you may have some programs such as the Emergency Management Performance Grant Program, where as a county, you're supplementing with GRF some expenditures to match that program at the 50% level. You can use these funds under the revenue loss category as matched to those programs. So it does spell that out. And it also says any funds that are beyond that revenue loss category, so you're in other buckets, can be used as cost sharing for specific projects that are in the infrastructure bill that was just recently passed under Bureau of Reclamation projects, and also certain broadband deployment projects. So I'm sure when those grants from the infrastructure bill get rolled out, they will have that language in there that will allow some cost matching with the ARPA fiscal recovery funds. So that's important as well to know in case you think that you may be a recipient of some of that funding. And that is beyond the revenue loss portion. So public health and negative economic impact. So that's that first bucket of the 4. So I've gone through the revenue loss. Hopefully I don't lose like 50% of you because you're like, oh, my entire allocation. But again, you know, you still have all these other eligible categories that you can use the funding. And so public health and negative economic impacts is the one in the final rule that I think had the most changes. And so it really it really split that category out into 6 different areas. So it talks about public health, it talks about assistance to households, small business and nonprofits, and impacted industries, and the public sector capacity. So all 6 of those areas are eligible categories under that very first bucket. It also talks about in the final rule, really talks through, and I know I've talked about this before if you've attended any of my webinars or you see me talk in person, about this 2-pronged test for eligibility under this bucket. If it's not considered an enumerated or a listed eligible use of funds, then there's always this test. Well, that test is really predominant in the final rule. So Treasury is still saying that if you do move forward with something that is not listed, specifically listed as eligible, then it must meet this 2 criteria test. And they really reinforce it in the final rule. 1, it is a public health or economic impact on a specific household, business, nonprofit, a class of households, businesses, or nonprofits, and you have a specific impact. And you designed a response to address that impact. Now, where Treasury has added additional information in the final rule is they state that your response to that impact must be related, responsibly proportional, or reasonably proportional to the harm identified, and reasonably designed to benefit those that were impacted. So they're really saying you must have that relationship to COVID. It must be a proportional, so you look at the impact, what your program is designed to compensate must be reasonably proportional to that impact. And it must be reasonably designed to help those that were impacted. So those are those key concepts, again, that you need to make sure you're meeting that criteria for eligibility. But Treasury does kind of talk through some presumed populations. And so they really introduced this concept that if you have a presumed population, which we'll talk through who those people are, what those presumed populations are, and a enumerated item, a use of funds. So it's specifically listed as eligible. If those two factors are in play, then you are clearly operating consistently with the final rule, and Treasury has no issue. Now, they do say that they do not pre-qualify projects, so they're not necessarily going to go through a project if you submit it to them and pre-qualify it as eligible. So it's really the burden is to go through this criteria and make sure that you can check the boxes and document how you are meeting the eligibility. So this is the criteria test. If there's something that's not on this list as enumerated uses, you can still meet a population that's not listed. You can still use it for enumerated, or I'm sorry, a non-enumerated use. You just need to have a stronger burden to document how you got to eligibility. So I'm not going to read through everything on this, but here's in the public health space, and I talked, there's 6 areas, right? So this is the first one, public health, which is mitigation and prevention measures. So these are all of the specific things that are listed. I just highlighted a few things that I thought might be interest to some of our local government friends, such as prevention and treatment equipment, and they call out ventilators and ambulances, ventilation system installation and improvement, emergency operations centers, and emergency response equipment, which is emergency response radio systems. So some of those things I think typically funding in the past is kind of falls short, or it tends to be things that go unfunded or are harder to fund. So I wanted to highlight some of the areas I thought might be good eligible uses for our local government friends. So let's talk through, and in public health space, the general public is presumed eligible. So if you have to really have an impact, you're meeting the general public's needs of public health and mitigation efforts. So that one is kind of the presumed population there. In medical expenses, those are ones that are used for households, medical providers, and others that have incurred medical costs during the pandemic or as a result of the pandemic. Really the one I highlighted here that I thought would be of interest, paid family and medical leave for public employees to enable compliance with public health precautions. So it's something I think we saw a lot of use on the CRF. So I highlighted that because that is a new addition to the list. I don't believe that was on there before. So moving right along, behavioral health care. So this one, and I've got it underlined here, it's to the general public. So Treasury's already presumed that the general public is an eligible population for this. And this is really addressing the behavioral health issues and addiction issues and such from the pandemic. So all of, there's lots of things that are listed here. So if you can address one of these areas and it's to the general public, just make sure it's proportional and prereasonably proportional to the impact that you can assert as you're determining to do that project. Preventing and responding to violence. I believe this was in the FAQ before. It was really listed as eligible, but I don't know that it was called out as well as it is in the final rule. So it is eligible to use funds to respond to increased violence due to the pandemic, and they have many enumerated eligible uses, such as trauma recovery centers, community violence intervention programs. And it does say that communities are experiencing increased gun violence. You can, law enforcement officers focused on advancing community policing, enforcement efforts to reduce gun violence, including prosecution and tech and equipment to support law enforcement response. So that is specifically called out as an enumerated use. So we already talked a little bit about population presumptions. So under the negative economic impacts, that is one of those areas, and it has assistance to households and communities, nonprofits, individuals. That Treasury really called out that there's these presumptive populations, and before it was all in a QCT, so they've broadened that. And they have 2 areas. So they say you're impacted directly or you're disproportionately impacted. And we talked through those definitions. And I want to go through each of these areas and kind of show what that means. So assistance in households and communities, there's this kind of a table that's got both sides of it. So if you're looking to do something in this space to help your community, They considered impacted households as being low and moderate income households, defined as those at or below 300% of the federal poverty guidelines or 65% of the area median income. Treasury has provided a tool, which at the end of this slide deck, there are several slides with resources. You can get to it through our link there. But they've provided a spreadsheet for you to kind of look at what these thresholds are, because they recognize that there's a little complication, with all of this, that they've added that. So they do have a spreadsheet as a tool so you can determine what these thresholds are. And so really they added this component of impacted, and it really, households experiencing unemployment or food or housing insecurity. So there's a couple different levels where you could have impacted households. Those that qualify for certain federal programs. So you could be an impacted household because you qualify for maybe CHIP or child care subsidies, but you could be a disproportionately impacted household because then you also qualify maybe for TANF, WIC, Section 8, LHEAP, SNAP. So, so they've kind of drew a line at some point and determined who might be impacted and who might be disproportionately impacted. They have a couple on here if you're doing affordable housing programs or if you're addressing K through 12 instructional loss. So I'm going to go through all of these. There's a couple on here, it's NA to Ohio, tribal governments, and anybody in a U.S. territory or receiving services is just automatically considered disproportionately impacted, just for general knowledge, not that that impacts us in Ohio. But if I flip to the next slide, then it really talks about enumerated uses of funds based on your impact. So if you're an impacted household, then food assistance. So you've already shown that you're impacted because these households, you design a program and it meets the criteria of eligible households, so you get your eligible population. But then you're going to maybe do a food assistance program, so that's eligible because it's an enumerated eligible use. So you can go through and kind of figure out, do I have impacted households, or am I going to establish a program to really benefit my impacted households, or am I working at disproportionately impacted? So those that maybe were on SNAP or WIC, you can then jump over to remediation of lead paint or other lead hazards. So if you were doing a program such as that, you couldn't really, unless you could show that there was an impact, which would be hard. So you really can only get to the disproportionately impacted households. So you kind of have to map up the enumerated uses with the population presumptions. Now, Treasury does say that you can define another population, but you have to show that they had impact as a result of the pandemic to get them into that category. Here's the small business presumptions. Treasury did define small businesses as having no more than 500 employees in general. And they're independently owned and operated. They're not dominant in their field of operation. So if you're, looking to do a small business program, you need to kind of be within that criteria of that definition. And then again, they've got who's impacted. So if you're an impacted small business, you've seen maybe a decrease in revenue, or you've had increased costs, or you don't have the capacity to weather a financial hardship. And then you go to the disproportionate, and that's where you go back to the interim final rule, right? They're in a QCT. So they're saying if you have small businesses that are in a QCT, then they're a presumed population for the enumerated uses. And then here's the enumerated uses. So they talk about impacted small businesses, the loans, grants. I have a little asterisk next to loans. If you do prefer, if you're going to do a loan program, make sure you're going back to, there's a lot in the FAQ. I do understand the FAQs will probably be updated for the final rule in the coming weeks to really figure out what those loan provisions are, because I know if you do like a revolving loan and the funds come back before the grant closes, they need to be dumped back into the program. So there are a lot of nuances to loans. So I just put a little asterisk next to that too. If you want to do a loan program, kind of do your homework on that piece. Technical assistance, counseling, or other support to support business planning. So that's really in your impacted small businesses space, and then you're disproportionately. So then you can kind of go on to another area. Like if you have a business that's in the QCT, then you can do rehabilitation of the property, the storefront improvements, facade improvements, more technical assistance, even grants for startup for expansion costs for small businesses and support for micro businesses. So it kind of expands the enumerated list for those that are in that. So let's talk about nonprofits. Treasury does define those as 501c3s and C19 tax exempt organizations. So if you are looking to fund nonprofits who have been impacted, you can definitely, if they've got decreased revenue, financial insecurity, same types of things that were with the small business, they can show that they have an impact. You can definitely design a program under the enumerated uses. And then if you have one that's in a QCT, so you have a not-for-profit that's in a QCT, then they're automatically disproportionately impacted. And again, here's the list that Treasury has enumerated uses for that. Again, loans. Again, the loans, I probably should have had the asterisks there. Definitely look into the guidance if you're going to do a loan program, but you could definitely do grants, beneficiary payments to not-for-profits. They become a beneficiary. You can provide them 1099 tax documents, as revenue, if you're wanting to give them assistance for impacts, financial impacts that they may have had, but they are not a subrecipient. So that also is one of the keys that was called out, and I'm not going to address that much today, but that some of these assistance programs to individuals, businesses, nonprofits, they are all considered beneficiaries, that you're giving them kind of a benefit, and the federal requirements don't follow through with the funding. So it's not that they have to have now a single audit and such. It's not a sub-grant where you have to continue to monitor it. You are paying them for an impact that you've already identified, you've documented, and so it's a little bit different. So they're considered a beneficiary relationship. And then here's disproportionately impacted not-for-profits. There's a lot of flexibility. In the final rule, it talks about the recipient, which would be you if you're making the decisions on ARPA, that you have flexibility to determine appropriate response, and as long as it's related and reasonably proportioned to addressing their impacts. So that's the only one I think where I've seen where they didn't give a specific enumerated item. Assistance to impacted industries. Now this one had changed a lot. It was a bit vague before because I think there was some confusion on, using the funding to kind of bring more tourism to an area versus kind of bringing back tourism or impacts, addressing impacts. So they do say there's two main ways that an industry can be designated as impacted. So the industry is in the travel, tourism, or hospitality sectors. So it's already a presumption. If you have you have travel, tourism, or hospitality, they've been impacted. Or the industry's outside of that, but you can meet this. This is a new two-prong criteria, new to the final rule. The industry experienced at least 8% unemployment loss, 8% employment loss from pre-pandemic levels, or they're experiencing comparable or worse economic impacts as the national tourism, travel, and hospitality industries. So it's in comparison to those industries as of 1/6/22, which was the final rule date. If they are experiencing worse than that, then you definitely could aid that industry. It does talk a little bit about qualitative data or quantitative data. If the qualitative data is not around, you're definitely going to want to, if you're going to aid an industry outside of the three that are presumed, have your ducks in a row and be able to meet this test and show how you got there. And make sure that you keep that as a record. If you are ever asked, like you funded this industry that was not part of a presumptive industry, how did you get there? And that's like anything. If you're going to go outside an enumerated eligible use or fund a population that's not specifically listed, you're going to want to document how you got there. But the final rule does provide flexibility for you to define it. And aid may only be provided to support operating for those that were operating prior to the pandemic and affected by required closures and other efforts to contain the pandemic. That was added in the final rule. That I don't believe that was there before. So you just need to be careful that you are funding folks with aid to industries for people that were operating prior to January 27th of 2020, and they were affected by closures. So they were truly affected by efforts that were helping to contain the pandemic. So here is the enumerated eligible lists for the aid to impacted industries. You can provide mitigate financial hardship by supporting payroll costs, lost pay and benefits for returning employees, supportive operations. We used to call those business interruption costs, which was in the CRF guidance. So any of those types of things, technical assistance, counseling, other services to support business planning to kind of help them through this. Also, any mitigation and infection prevention measures. That might be something that was an increased cost to them as well. So public sector capacity eligible uses, this was definitely expanded. There was no change to, and I'm not going to talk about this today, public safety, public health, and human services responding to the pandemic. It was in the interim final rule, continues to be the same. There was no changes to that. But there was some changes to restoring pre-pandemic employment. So it does provide additional funds for employees that maybe you can provide them experience pay cuts or were furloughed. You must reduce for any unemployment benefits that those individuals may have received, but you can compensate some public sector folks that may have received some of those during the pandemic as a result. It does talk to maintaining current compensation levels to prevent layoffs. It does talk about providing worker retention incentives, which is not premium pay, but it's to kind of help, with the labor, the way that it is, it's kind of additive to an employee's compensation to really help incentivize worker retention. It does talk that it must be less than 25% of the base rate of pay for an individual, 10% for a group, reasonably proportional to retain employees. So definitely comparable to what's going on out maybe in the private sector, covering ancillary administrative costs to this rehiring or hiring, support, and retention. So definitely if you have some costs to get back to your pre-pandemic employment, which was in the interim final rule as well, then that's the case. So to restore pre-pandemic employment, there's now two options. So you can hire employees back to your pre-pandemic positions. So if you laid people off or, that existed, so the positions that existed is January 27th, 2020. Maybe you laid off, they went unfilled, they were eliminated because of uncertainty. You can definitely pay for those folks with the funding, with this funding moving forward. Of course, know that that's kind of a fiscal cliff. I always caution when you're covering payroll with a federal grant. Or you can hire above pre-pandemic baseline with some flexibility in positions. So you can support an increase in your budgeted FTEs of up to 7.5% above the pre-pandemic baseline. So they're really recognizing the underfunding in the public sector and the lack of positions in the public sector and allowing a 7.5% above your pre-pandemic baseline. And they talk about how you do that. So you identify your FTE at January 27th of 2020. You determine what 7.5 looks like, and that's your adjusted baseline. You identify your budgeted FTE as of March 3rd of 21. That was the beginning of the performance period. And then you take your adjusted baseline, you subtract your actual FTEs that were at March 3rd of 21, and that's the total number of FTEs that can be covered with the funding. And they don't necessarily have to be the same positions that went unfilled as you have in that first option. So that's a new option in the final rule that maybe many of you may want to entertain. Effective service delivery was also mentioned, really supporting program evaluation and data outreach, making sure, there's all the community outreach that we're doing, assessing data, all of your programs and evidence resources. And a lot of that ties right back into these projects that you're doing to making sure that, it's meeting evidence-based standards, which is not required, but recommended or encouraged. And it talks also about addressing administrative needs. So administrative costs for running some of these programs that are even responding to the pandemic. Also, it does discuss needs caused or exacerbated by the pandemic, such as backlogs caused by the pandemic, increased repair and maintenance needs. And some of that was in the FAQ from before. Premium pay, I don't want to talk about this too much other than some of the key changes, the use of eligible workers. You still need to be within that, but they've expanded that use, or a chief executive can determine. The rule did provide some flexibility. So before it was kind of a written justification of over 150%, but now you don't have to provide that if they're not exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act overtime provisions. So that was kind of a little bit of flexibility there. And I have it in bold here, volunteers cannot receive premium pay. So if any of you are considering maybe a volunteer fire department, giving them premium pay if they were truly volunteers, it is clearly stated that they cannot receive premium pay. Now, if you bring them on as employees for a period of time to pay them, that's different. But if they are considered volunteers, they cannot receive premium pay. So some key changes in the water and sewer space. They do say that they provide some additional eligible projects, but they say that you must determine them to be necessary. So necessary means they must be responsive to an identified need or maintain adequate minimum level of service. And then they must be cost-effective means for meeting that need, considering alternatives, and for investments in infrastructure that supply drinking water in order to meet projected population growth. So again, you can't do water and sewer projects necessarily for economic development purposes, but you can look for a projected population growth. And they added culverts, residential wells, dam and reservoir rehabilitation, which only if it's related to drinking water. And then there was a broad set of lead remediation projects that was also added. So that's very encouraging. It goes a little bit beyond the two projects that were added. Broadband infrastructure, they relaxed a little bit of those requirements. They did add additional requirements to identify your area, design your project to meet your high-speed technical standards. And it did add that there needs to be an enrollment in a low-income subsidy program. So what you need to require your service provider in these cases to either participate in the SCC's Affordable Connectivity Program or provide access to broad-based affordability programs to low-income consumers that's commensurate with that program. So that was added in the guidance. I want to talk through reporting requirements quickly. I know we have just a few minutes left. I wanted to make sure that everyone was aware that if you're an NEU, you are direct to the Treasury. You'll be doing the reporting with the Treasury. So that is a question that we get a lot. Reporting is completed in the U.S. Treasury portal. And the reporting applicability is really based on your entity type or your reporting tier. So this is kind of the new chart, and I stole this directly from the Treasury. If you're in, a tier 1 or 2, then you're already working on your reporting now because it's due by the end of the week or by Monday, well, the 31st. I think that's Monday. I'm losing track of time. And so, so if you are an NEU or a smaller, below 250,000 metro, city, and county, you have till April to start that reporting requirement. And remember, first reporting is when you were going to elect what you're going to do with your revenue loss. So that's really the most important part of this first reporting that you're going to do. Now, I talked about capital expenditures early on. So capital expenditures in the public health and negative economic impact section is eligible now, but this was the nuance. So with reporting, if you have a project that is in the uses enumerated by Treasury, so it was in one of those lists I was talking about. If it is less than $1 million, you don't have to do written justification. But if it's greater than $1 million, but less than 10, then you must do it. But you are not required to submit that to Treasury. But if it's over 10 million, then you are required to submit that in your regular reporting to Treasury when you do your project and expenditures reporting. Now, if you are doing something that is not a complete enumerated listed item, then you don't have to do anything under $1 million, but anything greater than that, you're required and you must submit a written justification as part of your regular reporting. So what does that written justification include? So it's description of the harm that you're addressing, why your capital expenditure is appropriate, comparing against 2 alternative capital expenditures and demonstration of why yours was more superior. So kind of that cost benefit analysis, consideration of alternatives of improving capital assets, already owned versus or leasing options. That's definitely going to be key to defining that. And they also, Treasury presumes the following capital projects, I want to kind of spell this one out, are definitely ineligible. So new correctional facilities, as a response to increased rate and crime, new congregate facilities to decrease the spread of COVID, construction of convention centers, stadiums, other large capital projects intended for general economic development, or to aid impacted industries. And the reason why I want to bring those three up is we have had questions in our grants team on all of these projects, and that being the justification. Like, well, I'm going to build a new shelter because I'm trying to aid in the decrease of spread. I'm trying to spread people out. I think Treasury is trying to suggest that a better alternative may be to do a renovation of a currently owned property. And they're clearly saying that these are ineligible. So you're never going to get to eligibility with these projects. So I've talked about this before, so I kept it in the slide deck. But again, if you're doing project and expenditure reporting, we're not quite sure about what revenue loss is going to look like, but you're going to have to report on individual information over 50,000. And some of those key concepts, there's expenditure category, this is one of them. So expenditure categories, as you define what projects you're going to do, you're going to want to make sure that you have assigned an expenditure category to it, so that you know how you're going to report and you're kind of keeping a track. We talked about kind of keeping a matrix at the state level of what expenditure category ties to which project, because that is also going to tell you what reporting requirements you're going to have when you sit down to do that quarterly report. So I have here, there was an Appendix 1, which was in my previous slide decks, if you've seen before, right? That those were all of those categories, and that's at the back of the compliance and reporting guidance. And there's 66 of them. Those categories don't necessarily change, but the Treasury has added now Appendix C in a user guide that was released on January 7th. All of these links are in the back of our presentation. It provides a mapping of those categories to various reporting templates. So you're going to want to go out as soon as you kind of decide what your project looks like and you determine an eligible expenditure category, you're going to want to go out and see what types of information you're going to need to report back to Treasury, because that's really going to help you determine what you need to collect when you establish your program. So I don't want to talk too much about projects today, but they'll be in my slide deck. I've already kind of talked about these helpful hints, but here are the resources that I've been talking about. So again, the final rule and supporting resources, you can go out to the main Treasury page and you can eventually get there, but I feel the page, at least for my, maybe I'm less technically savvy. I'm not the most, I'm not the best at searching the internet sometimes, or searching a web page and finding all of the links. So this will kind of help you navigate. It's got the main site, and then it's got your text, your final rule, your 44 pages that I talked about, most importantly, your overview of major provisions, that's that, or this is the 44 pages, your supplement compliance statement. So it tells you, you know, you can adopt it early. It's got your tool for determining low and moderate income households, like we talked about. So it would take you to the spreadsheet and give you what those thresholds are for your area. It's got a final rule webinar. If you didn't get to see that from Treasury, they recorded that and they have slides. It's got a compliance and reporting guidance. So all of these things are very important. And then that user guide I was talking about that gives you that mapping, that was released on January 7th. If you're an NEU, you should have already gotten a user guide on how to get into the portal and assign user roles. That we sent that out to all NEUs, but if you happen to miss it and you're on here today, there it is, assessing the Treasury portal. So all of these, there's several webinars on reporting too that Treasury just released late last week. So all of these will get you to a lot of information. Here's some general grant information. I know I talked about the uniform guidance. Here's a link to the uniform guidance as well. And there's our contact information, because that was a lot to unpack in 60 minutes. And but I wanted to give everyone an overview, let it sink in. We'll probably end up doing more in-depth webinars in the future as, you know, we get called for that. You know, if you send us questions and we start to see a lot of questions that are going out there. I did want to go over, so you can always contact us. We can help you navigate the process. Although we're not authoritative, you are direct recipients of Treasury. So slfrp@treasury.gov is the best way to get a true response back from Treasury. A couple things I did want to go over really quick, because I know we just hit 3 o'clock, is one, we've been getting some information that folks are getting their renewal to renew their information in the SAM. That's a yearly process. Just want to remind everybody, please do not pay someone to do that for you. It is free. There are companies out there that are kind of trying to manipulate their look in an email. They get their information, you get the information off the SAM, off the public facing information, and then they try to look like they are with SAM, and they send you an email, say it's time to renew, and then you kind of fall into that, and then they help you renew, but it could be to tune of $200, $400. You don't have to pay for that. If you're having problems navigating that, reach out to us. We will help you. Don't pay to renew with SAM. We can get you contacts with the Federal Help Clearinghouse, the help desk, or the Federal Help Desk. Definitely don't pay for that service. Revenue loss, you don't have to have had a revenue loss if you take that standard allowance. I think that was all of the other things. Oh, and if you are an NEU and you happen to be out there right now watching this webinar, you haven't asked for your funding yet. We have the portal up now through February 11th. If you know of an NEU and you're out here listening and you know they haven't asked for their funding, please encourage them to do so. That use of revenue loss is very, very flexible. That it could really, this is one-time money that can really impact a community. And we can help you navigate through this process. OBM is here to help and support you as much as we can, because we want all of the funds to kind of stay in Ohio and help every community within Ohio. So if you have not applied for that funding, reach out to us. Our portal is open through February 11th so that we can get the remaining 100 that have not asked for funding. We do have a list of those that are out on our website. If you're curious, if you're a county and curious who's still left in your county, that is out on our ARPA link in our website. So I think that I'm at 3:02. I hate to go over, and I apologize for keeping you. If y'all want to go out and play in the snow today, did we get any, I'll ask really quick, did we get any overwhelming questions that, you know, were repetitive that we could address maybe in the next 60 seconds?
I do have one, Stacy.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Okay, yeah. So a question we got is, if an entity selected, you know, did their revenue calculation last year and maybe made some purchases, made some payments using that revenue calculation last year, are they able to switch to the standard allowance when they do their calculation for this year or their reporting?
We believe, and that's an excellent question. We believe our interpretation of reading this is that, yes, this is now an offered standard allowance that you can select that option in your first project and expenditures reporting and move forward. So I am sure the 10 million is over what you expended already as revenue loss at the time that you were taking it off of the calculation. We interpret that as in you can, until Treasury may have an FAQ that supports differently. There is nothing that says that you cannot change your election to that, because some of you may have filed interim reports that you might have selected or gave information on your first calculation, which will have to change anyways, right? Because they changed the 5.2%, and so there were some other things that changed. So since we didn't really have time for questions, if you do have questions, I think I'll go back to this slide. If you do have questions, email us, reach out to us. We are here to help. I'm sorry I'm over 4 minutes. I do appreciate your time today. We had over about 1,200 people sign up for this today, so I know this is information people are desperately wanting to not read 437 pages. So we are here to help try to decode all of that and help you through this process. And I appreciate your time and enjoy the snow today if you have snow in your area, and stay warm. See you next time.